Hi, I'm Nick Seiter. I'm a field crop entomologist with the University of Illinois. Today I'll be discussing management of mid-season insect pests in corn and soybean, with a particular emphasis on what we should be scouting for as we wrap up July and move into August. Those insect pests that we ought to be focusing on here in the middle of the season. I'll be discussing corn rootworm, Japanese beetle and corn rootworm beetles as silk clipping pests. I'll be discussing some defoliating insects in soybean, spider mites, as well as dectus stem borer in southern Illinois. And when we start talking about mid-season insect management, we really do want to focus on corn rootworm. You know, we're in the prime time right now for corn rootworm larval damage. This is when that damage that occurred earlier in the season as those larvae were developing is starting to show up. And this is really the time that we want to go out and assess corn rootworm damage in our various controls, in our trait packages. You know, if we didn't use a control, we want to go out and evaluate if we should have, so we can make a better decision for next year. If we did use a control, we want to evaluate how well that worked, both to just determine differential efficacy between the different products that are out there, as well as to monitor that over time to make sure we don't have some resistance developing in our fields. This is also the time to assess beetle populations, both in terms of what's coming out of our given trait packages and how well those are performing at keeping that population down, as well as making our decision for next year, whether or not a control decision is going to be needed in 2021 based on the beetle population that we have. So we want to be doing this in July to evaluate performance of last year's control, and we want to carry on that beetle population monitoring into late July and August to determine the need for a control next season. Now, what we don't want to do in evaluating our control performance from this year is wait until we see this at the end of the year from the combine. You know, we don't want to wait and find out that we had a rootworm problem at the end of the season for a couple of reasons. One, it's frustrating. It's no fun to learn that you had an underperforming control at harvest time. Two, you might be in a hurry at harvest time and unable to go out there and really evaluate, well, what caused this? Was it rootworm damage? Was it compaction? Was it a combination of these issues? It's also more difficult to assess the cause and difficult to assess especially the level of rootworm damage at this point in the season. You really want to be doing this now in July and August while those roots are still fresh, the damage is still fresh, and you can evaluate how much you really have. And there's a few things you can key in on when you're evaluating that control performance. You can dig up roots, although we're a little bit past this now, and look at the larvae. Count how many larvae that are on there, either by doing a float test or simply by examining the soil mass that comes up with that root ball in early July. Really the first 2 weeks of July is often when we would want to perform this task. You can look at the beetle populations out in the field simply through observation, looking both for their feeding damage, which you can see in the center picture there, as well as the adults themselves, and evaluating how many adults you're finding out there per plant. Or a little bit easier way to monitor the adults is with the yellow sticky card traps that we recommend for management decision making later on. However, when it comes down to it, when we're looking at control performance, really the proof is in the pudding, and what we really want to focus on is the actual damage that was done to those roots. Often you will see this above ground, especially if we have a nice round of storms like we've had over the last couple of weeks to push over those plants that had insufficient root growth due to rootworm damage. But really, to get at how much damage you've had and quantify how much damage you've had, you want to remove those roots from the ground, you want to wash the soil off of there, and look for this pruning, this discoloration, these roots that have been eaten away by those corn rootworm larvae. And that's what you want to evaluate, see how much of that pruning you have to determine how well your control performed for this year. So you want to examine that root ball when you're going through this for roots that have been pruned within 1.5 inches of the soil line. And what we're looking for is a cutoff in terms of unexpected damage if you're evaluating Bt trait packages for potential resistance. If you have half a node pruned away, so again, half of one node of roots, each root is going to have 3 nodes on it. If half of one of those nodes is pruned within 1.5 inches of the soil line, 1.5 inches of the base of the plant, that would be considered unexpected damage for that pyramided trait package. So even if you have a lot of adults in there, if you're getting damage at less than that rate, if you're having less than 1/2 of the node pruned away, that's within the range that we would expect in a normal year. You might have just had a high population. When we start having more than half a node of those roots pruned away in a pyramided trait package, so if you're looking at Smart Stacks or Duracade or Acremax Extreme, one of these trait packages that has multiple corn rootworm traits involved, that's where we're getting concerned. That's where we're thinking there might be a resistant population. That's where you'll want to call your seed rep up, call somebody up, and have them take a look at that population. Again, once you have half of a node pruned away by rootworm larvae. Now, when we get into monitoring for the adults, the easiest way to do this, not that it's necessarily easy, but the easiest way to do this is going to be with these yellow sticky card traps. You can purchase them from several sources online. Great Lakes IPM is one source for these, but there's various sources out there. You're going to place these either around the corn stalk, just above the ear leaf, or on a post in a soybean field. You have this little twist tie that comes with it, and we've actually done videos before on how to install these traps. You want to place 2 lines of 6 traps per field if you can. That'd be 12 total traps per field. Certainly if you have less than that, any monitoring information is going to be better than none, but we do want to have enough traps out there to make a good decision and get good coverage of that field, especially if we're going to use those data to make our decision for next year. There's a couple of ways that you can use these traps. One would be to place them as the adults are emerging earlier in the season, to really focus on those adults that came out of that cornfield in particular for determining how well that trait package was performing. And of course, you want to couple that information, as we just discussed, with information on the actual level of pruning that you're seeing in those fields. The other way to use these traps is to make control decisions for next season. So to determine the number of beetles that you have out in that field laying eggs, those eggs are going to overwinter and hatch into larvae the following year. That's how you can make an informed decision on whether or not a rootworm control is needed. Especially if you're in kind of that middle ground. You know, in northern Illinois over the last couple of years, we've had fairly high sustained rootworm pressure in some areas, especially in continuous corn, those areas where we have a lot of continuous corn production. Southern Illinois, less so. Southern Illinois, we've really had pretty low pressure over the last several years, and I'll say essential to Southern Illinois for that. If you're in between, it's been spottier, and that's where that monitoring information, especially in soybeans, if we're in an area where we have a rotation-resistant population, that's where that sampling is really going to pay off for you and help you to guide that decision. Now, if we're placing these yellow sticky traps and we're in a continuous corn situation, so we're monitoring corn this year that in a field that's going to be planted to corn next year, we're looking at an economic threshold of 2 beetles per trap per day. So if we're catching 14 beetles per week per trap in that field, that's a pretty strong indication that we need to put out a rootworm control in spring of 2021. If we're in a rotated field, we actually lower that threshold just a little bit to 1.5 beetles per trap per day. So if you're monitoring a soybean field that's going to be planted to corn next spring in 2021, we've got an economic threshold of 1.5 beetles per trap per day. So around 10 or 11 beetles per trap per week is going to justify a rootworm control in that corn planted the following season. Now for this process, we want to be monitoring a little bit later, especially in soybeans, but in corn and soybeans when we're using this as a controlled decision-making tool. So we want to start that monitoring in late July and carry it through August and make sure we hit that peak in beetle activity, which usually occurs during that window. And you're going to make that control decision on the peak population level. So you're going to take, of the 3 or 4 weeks that you sample these fields, the highest population, that's what you're going to use to make that control decision, whether or not a control is going to be needed. Now, in terms of scouting for insects, another thing that's on a lot of people's minds right now is silk clipping at pollination, and especially worried about insects feeding on those silks and interfering with pollination. Really becomes a concern during hot, dry conditions like we've just had through much of Illinois. Obviously, anything that's going to interfere with pollination can have a pretty serious impact on yield. Now, when we look at silk clipping and insects, the first 5 days of pollination are going to be the most critical. That's when it can be important to protect these plants if we have a significant level of clipping. One thing I will point out, just a little bit of clipping here and there is not going to have much of an impact. Those silks are growing continuously, and if they get eaten back just a little bit, that's still an effective silk. Where we start to get concerned about silk clipping is where we have those silks clipped back to within ½ an inch of the ear tip. And along with that, we have several rootworm beetles or 3 or more Japanese beetles per plant. We also want to make sure that that feeding damage isn't confined just to the edge of the field. And with Japanese beetles in particular, a lot of times we'll find that that feeding is quite severe. Maybe along the edge, you go 5, 6, 7 rows into the field, and all of a sudden you're not seeing them anymore. You know, we want to make sure we're making a whole field decision, not just an edge of the field decision when it comes to silk clipping. And keep in mind that these plants are fairly resilient. They're continuously producing these silks, and unless it's getting eaten away to within that ½ an inch of the ear tip, that plant's still going to be able to pollinate. And you might consider reducing that threshold a little bit if you're in hot, dry conditions. Now, throughout Illinois right now, I was actually just looking at the crop condition report before I started this webinar. A lot of our fields have begun silking. And a lot of our fields are getting towards the end of silking. So when you have this feeding on brown silks, and Japanese beetles in particular, I tell you, they love to continue feeding on those brown silks. Once you have those brown silks, that pollination has already been completed, for better or for worse. When you have feeding after that pollination has been completed and you spray those beetles, you'll still kill them, you know, you'll still kill those insects, but at that point you're only getting revenge on them. You're not actually saving yourself any yield. You're not actually improving pollination when you make an application like that. So you want to make sure in those cases, and they're fairly rare in field corn in Illinois, a little more common obviously in sweet corn and in seed corn and some other specialty varieties of corn. Pretty uncommon to need an application for these silk-feeding insects, but you never need an application for them after pollination has already been completed. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking about making a spray for these. Don't waste your money on a field that's already at brown silk, where this is already completed. And I say that simply because in Illinois every year we waste money on applications for silk-clipping insects in fields where pollination has already been completed. Now this is an interesting one I wanted to bring up just really quickly for this season. That's the red-headed flea beetle. Many of you have been calling, emailing in Illinois and in surrounding states as well with unusually high populations of this insect. It's a fairly conspicuous insect. It can be kind of hard to track down when you find it. They call it a red-headed flea beetle. If you look very closely at the head, it does have a dark red tinge to it. But we've seen fairly high populations of this red-headed flea beetle in Illinois. in 2020. And one thing that's important to point out, you don't want to confuse this with the corn flea beetle. That's a much smaller insect. That one's really about the size of a pinhead, quite small. That's the one that will vector Stewart's wilt, especially in sweet corn and specialty corns. They can vector that in field corn as well, but most of our varieties have some varietal resistance built in field corn. So these insects, these red-headed flea beetles, rather than vectoring a disease, are simply feeding on the foliage, causing that window pane damage that you see. That tends to be cosmetic. It would take a pretty extreme amount of that in corn to cause any sort of a yield reduction. We'll also see them in corn feeding on the silks and even clipping the silks to some extent. What I haven't seen, and if you have, feel free to email me and let me know, send me a picture if you've seen red-headed flea beetles clipping silks to within half an inch. Where I've seen these feeding on the silks, they'll feed on the silks, clip one or two here and there, but not at levels that we would expect to interfere with population. Again, it takes a lot of that clipping and sustained clipping over the first 5 days of pollination to really have an effect there to actually inhibit pollination. You also have with red-headed flea beetle, it feeds on a wide variety of different plants. It can actually be a serious pest of some container ornamentals in parts of the country. It is a minor defoliating pest in soybean as well, and you'll find that especially along the edges of fields, and in fact, especially along the edges of fields bordering corn. So you will find these in soybean in addition to corn. Again, most of the time, we're talking about cosmetic damage here. I haven't really looked at a field yet where a control for red-headed flea beetle was justified. But it is out there this year, something to keep an eye on. And just consider holding off on putting out an application for some of this damage that's really going to be cosmetic. It's not really going to impact yield. Speaking of defoliators in soybean, and speaking of soybean in general, these are really the major players right now, this time in the season, as far as insect pests that we're likely to find in a soybean field. We have a wide variety of them. I've shown you a few of the most common ones here. We have, of course, Japanese beetles, which are highly conspicuous in just about every soybean field in Illinois most years. We have the green cloverworm. That's this little green caterpillar with 3 prolegs on its back end. This one's a very common resident of soybean fields in Illinois. Rather uncommon for this one to reach any sort of damaging levels, but really it would be hard, if not impossible, to find a soybean field where you're not going to find a few of these guys. In some areas, we've had some damage from the thistle caterpillar down in the bottom center here, sort of spiky caterpillar. Actually becomes a painted lady butterfly, or rather pretty butterfly. You can get some defoliation, especially early in the season from these, and in some cases you can have some fairly severe defoliation. They've seen a lot more issues with this insect to our west in Iowa, in Missouri. They seem to have had higher populations of this over the last few years than we have here in Illinois. Another one that's very common to see, the bean leaf beetle here on your right. Occasionally you'll have these. They'll be sort of a reddish bronzes color like you see here. They'll be yellow. They'll have spots. They'll lack spots. They're always going to have this little black triangle behind what we call the pronotum. It's going to be pointing towards the rear of the insect. So look for that black triangle, and that will help you to distinguish the bean leaf beetle from some of these other small beetles that can be found in a soybean field. But again, we've got a variety of different insect pests that will feed on soybean foliage. And this can be a concern in some cases. When we're managing these insects, what we want to focus on first is the level of defoliation that we're seeing. And if that defoliation reaches a level where it's a concern in terms of yield, then we want to think about putting out an application to control whatever insect it might be. And it becomes important at that point to identify which species or multiple species are in the field so that you can select a control accordingly. However, we've got a bad habit in Illinois, really throughout the country in soybean production, but we'll focus on Illinois in particular here. We've got a bad habit of spraying some cosmetic damage, some low levels of defoliation that aren't going to do anything in terms of yield. And in this case, I'm pointing out some damage actually from the Redheaded flea beetle. You can see one of them, maybe if you look closely in the center of the screen here. They're chewing these little pinholes in the leaves. If you go in and actually assess the level of damage in this field, we're talking about less than 5% defoliation. Now that's not going to cause any impact on yield at all, but yet every year in Illinois, fields get sprayed with levels of defoliation like this, similar to this, for no real reason. And it's like a lot of bad habits, you know, if you buy a Starbucks coffee every day, or if you buy a can of chew every day, or a pack of cigarettes every day, that one day's expense might not seem like a whole lot. But you start adding that up over time, it turns out to be a pretty expensive habit. With insecticides in soybean in Illinois, it's the same way. Any one insecticide application, I know it's not very expensive. A lot of times we're talking about maybe $1.50 an acre. You know, and when you compare that to the fungicides, even some of the adjuvants, the herbicides that we put that out, seems very cheap. But when you start adding that up and you start putting that in every application, and it's not doing anything for you, it's not giving you anything in terms of yield, that's simply a wasted expense. And that's something, if you're watching this, I would challenge you. If you don't have a good reason to put that insecticide in the tank, hold off. Save the money, save the selection pressure on those insects, save the beneficial insects that are out there helping to keep those populations down for you. But we don't want to be spraying levels of defoliation like this that frankly aren't doing anything whatsoever to yield in that field. Where we start to get concerned about defoliation from insects in soybean, after bloom, we're talking about a threshold of 20% defoliation. Now, I'll tell you, I haven't walked a lot of fields in my career, even in the southern United States, that were above 20% defoliation. I've walked a handful of them down there. I've walked a handful of fields that were quite a bit higher than 20% defoliation, but not many. This picture on your left is a field where we actually went out and measured percent defoliation. We measured it with a computer software. You can see a mock-up of this on the right that actually goes in and measures the area that's been defoliated and gives you the percent defoliation for that field. That's what 16% defoliation looks like. That's pretty tattered, isn't it? That's pretty torn up. When you're at those kinds of levels, you know, 16%, we're getting close to that economic threshold of 20%. You're going to know it. And so I wanted to put that picture up there so you'll see this is where you need to start getting concerned. When you're seeing levels of defoliation like this, that's where you need to be thinking about putting out of control, again, if that insect is still out there in the field. You don't want to be putting a spray out for this. You don't want to be spraying these cosmetic levels of defoliation. And when we talk about holding off on those insecticide applications when they're not necessary, here's a great reason to do that. Here's a great reason to hold off on those. So spider mites, not an insect, but relatively closely related, and they do a similar kind of damage. They behave in a similar way to insects in many ways. This is a pest that can actually be favored by one of those unnecessary broad spectrum insecticide applications that actually takes out some of the beneficial insects, the beneficial mites that help to keep these populations in check. And especially when one of those applications goes out and it's hot and it's dry, those are going to be the conditions that favor spider mites. You can actually cause a pest outbreak that you wouldn't have had before. What we're looking for in terms of scouting for spider mites is this discoloration in the field, this yellowing, this bronzing of areas throughout the field. You'll see that from a distance. You'll see it in patches at first. Oftentimes, many of those patches are along the edges of the field, along grassways in particular. Often they will show up right after a field has been mowed. When you mow those grassways, it forces the mites to leave and seek a different food source, and they have the soybean field right there. If you look closer at that discolored foliage, if it's spider mites, you'll see this sort of sandblasted appearance, this stippling of the leaves where you have alternating sort of specks of discolored area interspersed with green. And that's what we're looking for. If you look closely at that, if you break out your hand lens, you'll actually see the tiny spider mites running around on that leaf. You might see their eggs, sort of a white globe-shaped egg on there. And if you're in a heavy infestation, you might see some leaves that are sort of gummed up by the webbing that they produce. They actually do produce a webbing similar to a spider, part of the reason they have the name. When you start to see that webbing on there, it tends to mean that you've got a fairly high population when we're talking about soybean. Now, the economic threshold for spider mites can be a little bit tricky, and it can vary a little bit. During pod fill is going to be the most sensitive time to this type of damage. We talk about an economic threshold of 10 to 15% discoloration during pod fill. But you don't just want to consider the level of discoloration you're seeing out there. You want to consider, well, are these patches of spider mites growing or are they receding? What's the weather forecast look like over the next few days? Are we going to receive continued hot, dry, droughty conditions that really favor those spider mite outbreaks and that make that stress, the impact of that stress on the plant worse in terms of yield loss? Or do we have some rains in the forecast? Do we have some nice soaking rains that are going to alleviate some of that stress and disfavor those spider mite populations? So you really do want to keep that weather forecast in mind when making a controlled decision. Now, spider mites can be difficult to control. Again, they're not an insect, and not all insecticides are going to be effective against spider mites. You do have several actual miticides, including a product called abamectin, a chemical called abamectin, that performs pretty well against spider mites and actually has a little bit better residual activity than some of the other products that you have out there. You'll have bifenthrin, which is a pyrethroid, and dimethoate, which is an organophosphate, that are also labeled as miticides that will affect those mite populations but might not last as long. And often with those, you do want to perform a follow-up scouting trip 5 days after the application to verify whether or not you still have mites out in that field that you might need to control with a follow-up application. Again, very dependent on the weather and on the stress condition of the crop. When you get into that stressed situation and you have a spider mite outbreak, it can be really pretty damaging and certainly something to watch out for in soybeans this time of year, especially if we get another run of these 90-degree days with very little moisture. Thankfully, at least over the next couple of days, at least in central and northern Illinois, that doesn't seem to be what we have in store. So hopefully that continues. Finally, for those of you in southern Illinois, I did want to discuss the Dectus stem borer. This is an insect that we've been seeing more in recent years. We've been paying more attention to in recent years. And if you want to assess your field for how much infestation you have going into the fall when we can see lodging from Dectus stem borer infestations, now's the time to do that. Now's the time when you want to identify those fields that might have a Dectus problem. That you might need to pay some extra attention to at harvest time in the fall. What happens with Dectus stem borer, you can see here that little larva burrows its way down into the stem of the plant at harvest. It's actually girdled this stem here, made it weaker, and that stem's in great danger of falling over if even a little bit of a breeze comes through towards the end of the season. And so you can get lodging that's actually going to have a much greater effect on yield than this boring inside of the stem, which has little to no effect in and of itself. We don't recommend insecticides for Dectus control. We've been unable to see any sort of an economic return from that. Very difficult to get control of this insect that's actually inside of the stem. Rather, what we want to do in terms of management at the end of the year is prioritize fields that are infested heavily with dectus and that are at risk for lodging, try to get those out of the field, harvested as soon as we can to mitigate the effect of that. So when we're scouting for dectus stem borer this time of year, we're looking for three things. Often the first sign that you're going to see, or the first sign that you have dectus stem borer out in the field, is going to be these wilted petioles, this picture in your lower right. That adult beetle is going to come by. She's going to lay her egg in that petiole, and that larva will begin feeding within that petiole, and that feeding is actually going to kill that petiole. Now, we don't see enough of this even in very heavily infested fields to amount to anything in terms of defoliation, but it is a sign that those larvae are out there. You might pick up the adults as well, especially if you're going through that field with a sweep net. They're this sort of blue-gray, what we call a longhorn beetle. You see the very long antennae up in your upper right here. That's another indication that you might have some infestation. And then as the season develops, those larvae get larger. And if you split open the stems, you'll see them feeding on the pith within that stem. Of course, that's nothing that you're going to miss, right? And we'll start seeing that in these infested fields really towards the end of July, and especially on into August is when we will start seeing these larvae develop a little bit of size and be able to split those stems and find those larvae in there. And that's something, once you learn to look for that kind of damage, there's really nothing else like it in Illinois. You're not going to confuse that with any other insect. So if you start to see a lot of these signs, make a note of that. Make a note of how much infestation you have in that field. That might be a field that you want to pay attention to in a hurry when it matures. And especially at the end of the season, if you have a lot of that lodging getting ready to occur, you'll actually see little piles of sawdust at the base of those stems. That'll be a couple of months from now when we get into harvest, but that's going to be the final sign that you have that it's really time to get those soybeans out of the field as soon as possible when you start to see that situation to avoid that lodging, which would be the source of yield loss from this particular pest. So in summary here today, at the middle of the season, really scouting is key. Scouting is rule number one in IPM. We want to go out, we want to identify the sort of pest level that we have in a field and, make a controlled decision guided by economic thresholds, guided by when that control decision is actually going to put money in our pocket based on the insect population that we have out there. And again, with corn rootworm, this time of year really is critical both for evaluating how well we've done in 2020 in terms of rootworm control, following up on that control to make sure we're not losing efficacy over time. Corn rootworm, it's an insect that's notorious for developing resistance. Both western and northern corn rootworm, they've developed resistance to insecticide. They've developed resistance to crop rotation as a control, and they're developing resistance to the BT traits that we have out there. So assessing the performance of your controls is critical with an insect like this that just seems to have a way of overcoming anything that we throw at it. Also really important for next year for identifying the sort of pressure that we have in these fields right now and whether or not that's going to justify control action next year. Typically we think of northern Illinois, we think of central Illinois as areas where we need to really worry about corn rootworm. Even in southern Illinois, we've been hearing of some pockets of rootworm damage in continuous corn fields. So if you're growing continuous corn in southern Illinois and you think you're off the hook with corn rootworm, consider monitoring those adult populations and making sure you don't have a problem developing if you started to get into second, third, fourth, fifth year corn. Even in southern Illinois, we can see issues with corn rootworm and with western corn rootworm in particular. But you want to make that control decision based on data from your field, based on populations that you're observing in your field, not based on these overall trends. Overall, we're looking at a lower than average corn rootworm population over the last few years compared to what we were seeing 10, 15, 20 years ago, before the advent of these BT traits. you still want to be watching your own fields and making that decision locally based on monitoring information. With that, really appreciate your time here today. If you have any questions, if you're in on the webinar today, we'll have some time to ask those. If not, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email, get a hold of me on Twitter. And again, thank you for your time and thank you for participating in this Commercial Ag webinar series.
When was the last time you really noticed your surroundings? You really took note of everything in your environment. The simple act of pausing and noticing can be a great way to reduce stress and calm a busy mind. Hi, my name is Carla Belzer, and I'm a family life educator with the University of Illinois Extension. In today's moment for mental health, we're going to experience a grounding technique that can help during times of stress. Have you ever heard of the term mindfulness? Simply stated, mindfulness is paying attention and being aware of what is happening in and around you in the present moment. You could say that being mindful is being aware or having an awareness of all that surrounds you. And as we turn our attention to the present moment, we can actively work in reducing our stress and handling our emotions. Research tells us that practicing mindfulness not only helps with stress reduction and handling our emotions, but it can also help us concentrate better. It can improve our focus and attention, and it can even give us a greater appreciation for life. And there's various ways to practice mindfulness, from meditation to simply bringing our attention to our daily activities. Mindfulness practices can be used very quickly in a wide range of situations. The exercise we're going to talk about today is called a 5 senses scan, and it gives us guidelines on practicing mindfulness quickly in nearly any situation. All that is needed is to notice something you are experiencing by using your 5 senses. So we're going to follow this order to practice the 5 senses scan. First, we're going to notice 5 things that we can see. So look around you and bring your attention to 5 things that you see. Perhaps pick something that's small or that you don't normally notice, like a shadow or even a small crack in the concrete. Next, we're going to turn our attention to 4 things that we can feel. Bring our awareness to 4 things that we're currently feeling, and not emotional feeling, but physically feeling. Perhaps it's the texture of our pants, or the feeling of a breeze on our skin, or even the smooth surface of the table that our hands are resting in. Next, we're going to notice 3 things that we can hear. Quiet ourselves and take a moment to listen and note the things that we hear in the background. This could be a chirp of a bird, the hum of a refrigerator, or even the faint sounds of traffic from a nearby road. Next, we're going to notice 2 things that we can smell. So bring your awareness to smells that you usually filter out, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant. Perhaps the breeze is carrying a whiff of freshly mowed grass, or even the smell of a fast food restaurant across the street. Finally, we're going to notice 1 thing that we can taste. Focus on the 1 thing that you can taste in your mouth right now. If you need to, you can take a sip of a drink, you can chew a piece of gum, you could even eat something, or you could just notice the current taste in your mouth. So in review, we're going to notice 5 things that we can see, 4 things that we can feel, 3 things that we can hear, 2 things that we can smell, and 1 thing that we can taste. Engaging in mindful practice is an important part of any self-care routine. This quick and relatively easy exercise can bring you into a mindful state very quickly. This 5 senses scan can help calm your mind by using your senses to focus on your environment and surroundings instead of your own thoughts. What can you notice in your environment right now? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you feeling, tasting, and smelling? Checking in with our environment is just one of the many ways to use mindfulness to promote mental wellness. Consider using this quick technique the next time you need to calm your busy mind. I hope that you join us again for another moment for mental health.